Okay, well, a very, very warm welcome to an introduction to public sector tendering. We've got a lot of material to get through today, so we're going to take it quite fast in pace. But don't worry about that, because I've already sent a copy of the presentation to Julie, and if anyone would like a copy, Julie would be very happy to send it out to you. So don't worry too much about taking notes as we go through. So, just a little bit about me very quickly. I've got must be over 20 years now of public sector tendering experience, and I've kind of got quite good at it over the years, but that's because I've learned a lot of the tricks of the trade, and those are the ones that I'm going to try and share with you today. And just to give you an indication, in the last 12 months I've helped organisations, so that's charities, social enterprises and small businesses, to win over 146 million, and yes, that was 146 million pounds worth of contracts. So hopefully this session will also help you to get an understanding of where the public sector tendering is for you and what it means. So I thought it might be useful to start by looking at some of the myths that abound about public sector tendering. The first one is that actually there's an awful lot of contracts that are awarded each year. I mean, at the moment it's a staggering £236 billion. And a lot of people have been asking me recently with the public sector cuts, do I think that's going to go up or do I think it's going to go down? And I actually think it's going to go up, and we're already starting to see that as commissioners in public sector are having to look more rigorously at the services that they offer and see if perhaps there's a different way of doing it. Alongside that, people say to me, but it's really, really difficult for small organisations to win. Well, you might be surprised to hear that actually social enterprises and small medium enterprises actually currently win the majority of them. That's 59% by value here in the UK. And in terms of the very small businesses, those with less than 10 people, there's no figure specifically for the UK, but in the European Union as a whole, we actually managed to win 16% by value. So it's perfectly achievable. And not only that, but there's more good news, because this government has actually set a target whereby it wants to actually achieve 25% of new contracts going to social enterprises and small businesses. So it's all looking good so far. So I thought it might be useful to start by thinking about what a tender actually is, because lots of people use the word tender, they use the word bid, and they use the word proposal. So first thing, a proposal is what you tend to get in private sector, and that's a sales document where you're asked to respond to a need, but you're not told how to do it. So really it's up to you how you respond. The big difference with the public sector tender is actually that it's a formal document, and in it the customer, that's the public sector, actually tells you exactly what they want to buy, and they give you the instructions for how you need to respond to it. People use the word bid, and all that is your written response to a tender. But the very important thing to remember is that a tender is a legally binding competition, and that means that if you win the contract, you have committed to deliver the services or the works, so product, services or works. So hopefully that makes that clear. One of the biggest myths, though, is that people think that it's the cheapest that always wins. But one of the great things about public sector is that they will always tell you in the tender documents what percentage they are allocating as a marked price and what percentage they're allocating to what they call quality, and that's everything else. And the interesting thing is that it's very unusual for services to see anything where the price element is more than 40%. So what they're most interested in is the quality. It is a little bit different if you were actually supplying products to things like paper clips or chairs, in which case price is often the most important, but it will never be 100% of what they're looking for. So people say, well, that's all well and good, but what would a best value tender be? And the reason why we've got this lovely picture on the front here is to remind me of something called MEAT, M-E-A-T, which is the most economically advantageous tender will always win. So alongside price, there are a lot of other things that public sector will mark. So looking at here, and you can see on the bottom left-hand side, one of the things that they're looking at is social impact. And with the social impact bill, for the higher value tenders, they're going to be required to actually look at that now. But as you can see, there's lots and lots of different things that make up a tender, including things like convenience and service and innovation and quality. But two of the very important things that people forget that public sector are looking for are real clear evidence that you can deliver what you say you can deliver, and also they want to figure out, can they work with you? So that's where a lot of the questions actually come from. I thought it would be useful before we go into the process itself to perhaps look at some of the reasons why commissioners say that companies and social enterprises most frequently aren't successful. And they're quite staggering, and over sort of the last 10 years they haven't changed very much. And the first one is just quite simply that people don't follow the instructions. So they submit documents they weren't asked for, they don't do it in the right format, they don't answer everything that they were asked to answer. So their bid is classed as being not compliant, and it's not considered. The second one is that one about, can you actually deliver? The public sector looks for what it calls evidence. So it wants statements, facts, figures, where you've done it before to support what you're actually saying. Alongside that, using words and abbreviations that the buyer just doesn't understand. I think we're all a bit guilty of that. I know I am sometimes. We tend to think about what we do, and we know what the abbreviations are, and we know what the jargon means, and the public sector doesn't necessarily. One that I always find really surprising is that if you get through to the interview stage, and we'll talk about that in a moment when we look at the invitation to tender, then it's a poor choice of team for the interview. People don't take the best people to actually talk about their tender. And the other one, which in this day and age with word check and spell check and all of those kind of things, is not, you wonder how it happens. It's just a very poorly written response. It's either very difficult for the evaluator to understand, or it's full of spelling mistakes and grammar mistakes that makes them wonder actually about the accuracy of the rest of the information. So, the good news is you don't have to pay to find public sector tenders. So one of the questions that I'm often asked is, where can I find public sector tenders? And people say to me that they get a lot of emails offering them opportunities to subscribe to services that will find some public sector tenders. The services that you see when they come through on email asking you if you want to subscribe, they have a part to play, because what they're doing is that they are services that look across all the different websites where tenders are advertised, and they draw them together into one single email for you. So it's a convenience factor, but you don't have to do that. And here are some examples of where you can find public sector tenders for free. So on the first one, where I've got the Chest and London tenders, usually for your region there will be a portal that's an electronic website where you can go to and you can look at the regional opportunities. In the Northwest it's called the Chest, in London it's London Tenders, but there are versions of these across the country. You do have to register on these, so you have to spend a little bit of time to go on them, put in some details about your organisation. And one of the reasons why you do that is that the system will then send you emails on a daily basis that tell you of any tenders that come up within the categories that you've specified. I find that in all of these it's better to actually subscribe to more categories than you think you're going to need, because often the person who's actually loading the tender to the website doesn't think too hard about which category that they're actually loading it to. If you want to work in Scotland or Wales or Northern Ireland, they have their own particular portals and they're listed there. If you're interested in central government contracts, then there is a new website which is there, the Contracts Finder one, which is the third one down. And again, you register on that. And this is where you'll find details of all the government tenders that are over £10,000 in value. So that's pretty useful, particularly if you're quite new to tendering and you're looking for the smaller contracts. The next one, which is TED Europa, is actually for high value tenders. And to give you an indication of what public sector thinks is high value, that's anything that's over about £146,000 per annum. Blue light is the one for the emergency services, so that's for the fire service and for the police and for the ambulance service. And for the NHS, for those of you who like to work with the NHS, you'll already be only too well aware that the whole of the NHS buying processes are in the middle of changing. At the moment, the one that's national is SID for Health, and you register on that and then you'll receive details of the tenders. Most areas, also regions, also have their own version. In the Northwest, for example, it's the Northwest Consortium, which is shown here. But at the moment, until we've actually all very much clear about how NHS tendering is going to work, it's a little bit difficult to suggest what that might end up looking like. Multi-quote is interesting because that's used for spot buying, and spot buying tends to be, again, small contracts. Very useful, again, if you're looking for the smaller stuff. Construction line would be for anyone in construction, and that one's a little bit different because there is a subscription fee on that, but that's because you're actually registering to be an approved supplier. And the last one, supplycontracts.co.uk, is good for the low-value tenders. That's things that are under £146,000 a year, but you can only register free of charge for one area. And what you will find is that they'll inundate you with emails suggesting that you subscribe to other areas. You don't need to do that, because one of the things that I find is that on the emails they send me, they show me some details of the other tenders that are available across the country. And often if you do a very good Google search, you can find those on the websites of the organisations that are tendering. And that's probably the other thing that's worth mentioning, is if there is a specific public sector organisation that you want to tender for, so for example your local authority, they will also advertise all their tenders on their own website. So you just need to go onto their website and find the area that's the suppliers, and you'll be able to find them from there as well. The only trouble with that is that they don't tend to have a service where they can actually send you an email to let you know. So that was some good news. You don't have to pay to find public sector tenders. So what do you do when you've actually found a tender? Well, the temptation is to go running straight in and say, I'm going to answer it, but I would suggest that there's a couple of things that you might want to do before that. And the first one is to have a good look at it and decide, is this something that my organisation can actually do? And can I win it? So can I actually deliver what they're asking in the way in which they're asking? One of the things that people forget to do is to look at the amount, the value that it's being offered at. They will usually tell you roughly the range that they're looking at, and decide, can I do this profitably? Because that's going to be really, really important to your social enterprise moving forward. I mean, as you can imagine, public sector would like to get the cost as low as possible, and you need to be sure that you're delivering what you're delivering at a profitable rate. The other thing to do is when you get the documents through, is to have a look and just check, is there anything in there that would actually stop you from doing this? Sometimes, and quite a common one in there that you might want to go and take some advice on, for example, would be if it says that 2P might apply, and 2P is about actually transferring staff who are currently delivering that service to the new provider. So the other thing that I would also look on there is, do I need any help? So it might be that you can work with somebody else on this, and also looking for yourself on what are the risks. And that's the risks of doing it and the risks of not doing it, as well as any risks that you would incur. So here's the bit where it gets interesting. Public sector has so many different types of procurement processes that it can often feel like you're kind of working your way through a maze where you can't kind of figure out which route to take next. But once it's explained, it's really very, very easy. The most common process that public sector goes through is something that they call the restricted process. And I'm going to take you through that in detail in a minute. But all that actually means is that you have a two-step process. So they issue a pre-qualification questionnaire that asks you some basic questions. And I'm going to take you through what a pre-qualification questionnaire is in a minute. And they use that to get to a shortlist. And those shortlisted organisations are then invited to tender. So it's a two-stage process, a PQQ to get to a shortlist, and an ITT then to get to the person who's going to actually deliver for them. The second process that you'll come across is something called the open process. And this is really easy, because what they do is that they take the questions from what would have been a pre-qualification questionnaire with the questions and invitation to tender, and they put them together in one document. So it's a one-step process. Now, the interesting thing is that if you see that it's an open process, then that's usually a sign that it's well worth your while to look at it if you can actually deliver this. And the reason why you would do that is when they go to an open process, it usually means that they're not expecting a high number of people to bid for it. And if you think about it, that's because they have to then go through and mark every single tender. So the open process, for me, always says that's a great opportunity if I can deliver it. The next one that you'll often see is something called a framework. And when it's a framework process, what public sector is looking to do is to appoint a number of potential providers for whatever it is that they are want to actually buy, who then will be for a period of usually 2 years, can be a little bit less, would be the only people they can come to for that type of services or products. Of course, what that means is for at least 2 years, you've probably knocked out all of your competition if you manage to get on the framework. However, if you don't manage to get on the framework, then you won't be able to be considered for that type of work for however long the framework lasts. The other wonderful thing about frameworks is that there's often a clause built in that says that the public sector can extend them without going back out to tender, and usually for either 1 or 2 years. So potentially, you could have a framework where you're on the preferred supplier list for 4 years. When they go to framework, they might use either the restricted process or the open process, depending on what it is that they're actually buying. The other great thing about frameworks is because there's more than one provider that gets on them, they are slightly easier to win, so it can be a great way into public sector tendering for you as the first contract to actually win. If you see something called an e-auction, be really careful. This isn't the one to let anyone in your organisation near if they like eBay or something like that. And the reason is that having gone through a selection process, they will usually go through some form of a pre-qualification questionnaire. They then invite you on a specific day at a specific time to sit at your computer and put in your lowest price. What they then do is that the computer will tell you where you are in the set of bidders, so it will tell you whether you're the cheapest or the second cheapest or the third cheapest and so on, and invites you to put in a lower price until the auction ends. And at the end of the auction, the lowest price will have won. So that's one if you're going to get involved in where you really need to understand what your true costs are and what's the absolute lowest price that you can go to. And it doesn't tend to be used for services, it does tend to be used primarily for products where it's price driven. Also probably means if you're not competing on price, as in you're in one of the lowest costs in your market, then you probably are going to find it difficult to win that one. Competitive dialogue is an interesting one. This is one where the public sector doesn't actually know what it wants to buy. So what it does is it goes through a selection process, a pre-qualification questionnaire, to get to the smaller number of companies that it wants to then talk to. And the only difficulty with this is that you can find yourself in a very, very long process where you're helping public sector at your own cost decide what the service is. But of course, if you look at it the other way around, it's a great opportunity to show some innovation and to shape a service to suit. And finally, you'll sometimes see a negotiated process. And this just means that when they get to a specific stage, and they'll always tell you which stage, they can choose to go into negotiations with the people who are still left in the process at that point. Slight downside of that, of course, is that they have the information from each of the tenderers, which they can then use to negotiate one against the other. So, but the two you're most likely to see are the restricted and the open plus the framework. So, let's go through the restricted process very quickly. It's very easy, but I know that if you haven't seen it before, it can seem a little bit daunting. You're thinking, what on earth is it? So very, very simply, it goes like this. The public sector will let you know that they will publish a contract notice to say, we want to buy something. You'll then ask for the pre-qualification questionnaire documents. You'll complete those, and you'll send them over to the public sector people who will then mark them to get to a shortlist. If you get onto the shortlist, you'll be then invited to tender. So the public sector will send you the invitation to tender documents. You'll complete them and send them back, and they'll score them. Then, if it's a high-value tender, that's something over around £146,000 per year, they will issue a notice that they intend to award the contract. And the reason why they do this is that if it's a high-value contract, there's a legal standstill period, which is only 10 calendar days, that includes weekends, in which time anybody who thinks that they've made the wrong decision can make a legal challenge. But it is a legal challenge. In fact, the the best example of that recently was Virgin Trains, which I'm sure you all read about, where the franchise was actually given to another company, and Virgin within that 10-day period issued a legal challenge, and they were actually successful. Assuming there is no successful challenge, then the contract will be awarded to you, that will be formally confirmed, and then all you have to do is deliver it. So it's really, really easy. All it is get your PQQ and complete it, marks to get to the shortlist. Shortlist gets the invitation to tender, you complete that, they score it, and they award the contract to the one that achieves the highest score. So let's get into these wonderful documents that they call the PQQ and the ITT. Let's start with the PQQ. All this is, pre-qualification questionnaire, is a document where they will ask you some very standard questions, and their aim is to find out whether you're the kind of organisation that they can do business with. So what they're looking at is, do you have the capacity, so for example the staff, the equipment, the premises, whatever it is that you would need to deliver the contract, and also the capability. So have you got the experience, the qualifications, the evidence that you can actually deliver this to the required quality. And the invitation to tender document, that actually sets out how exactly you're going to deliver the service or the products to meet their specified requirements. The invitation to tender also includes your pricing. It often includes an interview and a presentation, and it results in a contract. So let's have a quick look at the PQQ. PQQs, once you get the hang of them, actually become quite easy because they tend to ask the same questions in every PQQ, and that's because they can only ask you about your capacity and your capability. So if you think about it, there's not that many questions that they can keep on asking. So they fall into three basic categories, and it's really important to remember that in terms of the way in which the public sector will mark your questionnaire, they start with the pass or fail questions. And if you fail any question, they won't look any further at your PQQ. And one of the reasons why I'm drawing that to your attention is because what happens in lots of organisations is because the pass or fail questions are usually yes-no answers, and it's providing some simple documentation of things around your accounts and your insurance policies and things like that, is often organisations either leave that to the very end or they delegate it to somebody junior who maybe doesn't quite understand what it is they're being asked for. And lots of organisations fail these questions, not because they should fail them, but just because they don't answer them correctly. So financial and business standing, they will typically ask you a series of questions that check whether you, for example, you do money laundering, and I'm sure nobody's going to answer yes to that one, whether you pay your taxes, whether you've had any industrial tribunal claims against you, and all of those kinds of things. And also, they will also typically ask you there about some of your financial information as well. The second set of questions are sometimes pass or fail, as in do you actually have them, and then they're usually scored based on whether they're acceptable or not. And again, this is very, very easy, and again, lots of organisations get knocked out at this stage just by perhaps not actually putting forward the documents that they should. So the first thing that you'll be asked for here are usually your policies, and these are the policies of your organisation, and typical ones that you'll be asked for time and time again are, do you have an equal opportunities or an equality and diversity policy? It'll be around your health and safety policy. You'll typically, depending on what you do, you might get asked about your environmental policy, and also things like safeguarding if it applies to your organisation. They may also ask for other policies, and it would depend upon what it was that they were actually trying to buy. They will ask about your insurances, and to work with public sector, you are usually going to have public liability insurance, employer's liability insurance, and depending on what it is you're providing, also professional indemnity insurance. The amounts that they ask for do vary depending on what they're buying, but just to give you an indication, typically they'll be looking for at least a minimum of £5 million for public liability, £10 million for employer's liability, and £1 million for professional indemnity. And again, it depends on how many staff you've got, but those insurances don't necessarily need to be expensive. I know that my own and I do have those levels run at around the £350 to £400 a year mark. Accreditations that they're looking for, they are looking to see whether you're an organisation that works to quality standards and also to environmental standards. Now, one of the things that people get a bit worried at this point is they tend to ask for something for quality called ISO 9001, and often you don't have it. I, for example, don't have it because it wouldn't be appropriate for the size of my organisation. If you don't have the accreditation, you'll always be given the opportunity to actually put what you do instead, and with a great form of words there, you'll be absolutely fine. I usually score very highly on that, and so you don't need to have the accreditations in place, you just need to have the systems. And then the last set of questions, so you think, wow, I've gone through all of that, and that will probably be about 2/3 of the questionnaire, which is the good news, because that's all basic stuff that you have about your organisation, will be specific questions that will be around your experience and your capacity to deliver this. And these will be scored, so they won't be pass or fail, they'll be scored. And the things that they'll typically ask you for here are where have you done this before, so your contracts that you've previously delivered, whether they are in public sector or elsewhere, and they'll typically ask you questions about references and some information about your company and what you do and how you do it. So that's a PQQ, and when you get good at PQQs and you get the hang of them, you really, if you're bidding for things that you're well qualified to do and have the experience to do, you should be getting through on at least 90–95% of those. So let's have a look at the invitation to tender documents. Now, these are a little bit more difficult, complicated, in as much as there's a lot of information. When you first get them, you think, wow, that's a lot of information. What am I going to do with all of that? Well, the first set of information that they will send you is some background. That's typically about the public sector body, the buyer, their strategies, their hotspots, and it's all useful information when you're responding. They'll also tell you, very, very importantly, how you have to respond to them, to the instructions, and also how they're going to mark it, and that will help you to actually structure your answers and think about what content you're going to provide. Now, this is the important bit. At this point, they also tell you exactly what they're looking to buy. They call that their specification. And at this point, you need to decide, do you still want to bid? Because often when you've gone through the PQQ, you're not too sure exactly what they want. At this point, you have an option to drop out and say, actually, it's not for us. They'll also give you the questions that they want you to answer, and they will also give you the contract schedule that you would be signing if you were successful. And again, you need to look at this quite carefully and decide, is there anything in that that's a showstopper for you, and do you still want to bid? Because the important thing to remember is that when you submit your invitation to tender document, you have said that if you win, you will deliver that product or service, and they will hold you to that. And there will be a clause built into the schedule, the contract schedule, that says if you don't deliver after you've signed this and you drop out at that point, that they can actually charge you for the cost of procuring, going back to that whole procurement process. So if that's a process and you want to tender, the good news is that there are things that you want to be doing now. And one of the reasons why you want to be doing them now is because typically, if you get a PQQ, you'll get about 2 to 4 weeks to actually respond to that. And for invitations to tender, it's typically at least 4 weeks. But that's not a lot of time to get everything in place if it's the first time that you've done this. So the first thing to do is actually to get to know your buyer. And by that, I don't mean just the individual, but I mean the organisation that you actually want to bid for. And the reason is that once they've actually issued a tender, any questions that you have to be submitted in the way in which they specify in the tender, and they will answer those questions and circulate the answers to everybody else who is bidding for that particular contract. So your time to get to understand the buyer, what their hotspots are, what their priorities are, and what they're likely to be wanting from somebody who wants to supply them is before they actually issue the contract notice. And lots of organisations, public sector organisations, offer meet the buyer opportunities, which you should always take up. You can do some web-based research on their website, look at their strategy documents and that kind of thing. You can also ask to meet the commissioner as well, and commissioners will normally do that, particularly if it's something that they're looking to buy in the near future. The other thing that's really important is you know what you do and you know how you do it, but it's time to think about that in the way in which the buyer would look at it for using their eyes. And the reason why you're doing that is you need to make sure that things like your public profile, so your website, and any social media profiles you have actually match what you're saying that you do in terms of your products and services, and that they appeal to the buyer as well. So you're thinking there about what do I do, what do they want to buy, and how do they match. The other thing that you would want to do, and I think I just mentioned it there, was to review your public profile. It's really interesting that obviously the commissioners have access to the internet too, and they will pop on and have a look usually. And it's not that you're being marked, but you know, I did get pulled up once when I did a consortium bid on behalf of somebody else, where really all I was doing was actually managing the contract for them, but I didn't say on my website that I delivered a particular service that they were looking for. So it's a great time, particularly if you haven't had a look at your website for quite a while, to just go on and make sure it's up to date. The other thing to do is to think about who else is likely to bid for this. And what's important here is don't just think about the third sector, and don't just think about the people who are locally, unless it's a very, very localized contract where only somebody local would want to bid. But think a little bit wider than that. Think who nationally might want to bid for it. And think about who might want to bid for it, for example, from the private sector as well. When you do that, what you can start to do is to draw out what are the key things that make me different. Where are my win themes? Why would somebody buy from me and not from them? And the other thing that you will want to do is think about whether at times you would want to work with another organisation to deliver a contract. And that would be some form of consortium or subcontracting arrangement. And the reason why that's there as well is that if you want to build a partnership to actually do that moving forward, it does take some time. And it's not something you're going to be able to do quickly. So it takes a little bit of time to get to know each other, to work out if you can work together and how you would do it. So that's something to do straight away. Other things that you want to do if you want to steal a real march on the competition is register on those systems. So on those portals that we talked about earlier where you can look for tenders, these days you usually have to submit tenders electronically back through a portal, and there's nothing worse. And I had an organisation that was doing this a few weeks ago. It was exactly the situation that you're a couple of hours away from actually having to submit it online, and you can't figure out your way through their website to do it. So now is the time to register with those systems. And to actually send for the documents for a tender, you can do that. There's no obligation to actually return them, and to work your way through how do you download the documents, how do you upload the documents, and so on. The other thing that you could do now that's really helpful is to think about some of the common information you're going to be asked for. So you're always going to be asked for your accounts, and typically the last 2 to 3 years. So having those in an electronic format and not having to scan them through at the last minute is very helpful. And also having your insurance documents in your insurance certificate in an electronic format, and your policies. And a little tip on policies is to make sure that all your policies are signed and that they're dated within the last 12 months. The other thing you can do at this point is, if you were thinking about going for any accreditation, so you were thinking about perhaps getting ISO 9001 registered for quality, or perhaps ISO 14001 registered for the environment, then you might want to do this now. But as I said, you don't need to do that if it's not appropriate for you. I don't, and it's not a problem. But what you do need to do in that case is sit down and actually look at what a quality management system is and what an environmental management system is, and come up with a form of words that your organisation is happy to work to as to how you would actually manage quality and how you would manage your impact on the environment. The other thing that you need to do at this point is to think about getting all your details of the contracts, the work you take contracts quite loosely here, so the work that you've delivered before. I had somebody yesterday, a social enterprise, who said to me, I haven't actually delivered any contracts, but she has delivered work to a hospital and to other organisations, and that counts. But the kind of information will typically be asked for is the date the contract started, what was the value of the contract, when did it end, what was it for, and the details of the organisation or the person who gave you the work. And that's really important. I have a little spreadsheet, and I have them in date order, going with the most recent on top. So at any point in time, I can just draw those up really, really quickly. And similarly, think about the type of work that you're going to be delivering, that the buyer might be buying, and think about who might be a reference for that, because you'll always be asked for usually 3 references, sometimes 2, that can actually speak for the work that you've done. And all they're looking for there is, have you done it before and have you done it well? The other thing is to get your evidence, and I know that there was a great webinar earlier on in this series about looking at social impact, and you're looking there for the evidence of what you've done before, how you've done it, and the impact that you actually make. And one of the things that's really useful there is to think about the difference between outputs and outcomes. And if you're at all unsure about what those actually mean, then the Big Lottery site actually has some really good information on there, some great examples. If you go into their rewards for all section, they've got a really great section on outputs and outcomes. To get really ahead of the competition, there are also some other things you can do. And I mentioned before getting comfortable with the systems and perhaps calling for an example of a pre-qualification questionnaire document. And that's really helpful because if you actually start to try and answer the questions that are on there, you're able to actually create what I would call some standard template answers, boilerplate answers, that you can then tailor to the specific PQQ that you ultimately receive. But that can save you an awful lot of time. The other thing that I do is I have something called a PQQ document library. So all my documents that I know I'm going to need to supply with PQQs, I keep in one place. And mine is electronic, and that's what you'd expect these days. But it means I always know where my latest policy is, my latest account, my latest insurance certificate. And that can save a lot of time, particularly if you're not the only person in your organization who does this. The other thing is that one of the things that can take quite a long time in lots of organizations is actually getting your management team on board and up to speed to understand what tendering means, how much time it takes, and what it would mean if you won. And again, that's not something to do in that sort of 4 weeks when you're trying to actually put together your first PQQ. So some time spent now to get them on board is really, really worthwhile, particularly if you've got trustees and governors and other stakeholders that you need to actually get on board with this. And the other thing is that if this is something that you think you're going to be doing a lot of, it's well worth considering getting some training or some help in PQQs and ITTs too. You know, even when you do all the preparation, you know, it can be a little bit daunting when you get your first one, and finding somebody or an organisation that can help you with that can also be really beneficial. So, can it be done? People say to me, can it be done? Well, I've already shown you the figures up at the beginning, but yes, it can. And these are just some examples of organisations that I've helped to actually win public sector contracts. The first one there on the top left with a beautiful tropical bird is actually a sole trader who works with the elderly and the disabled to provide gardening and handy person services. And that shows that even a very small organisation, it's actually an organisation where there are only 4 people in the organisation, have, including 2 apprentices, can and do win contracts. They've won a couple with local authorities and have done very well. In fact, they've won awards for the work that they've delivered out of those. So, yeah, even if you're very, very small, you can do that. Vision on the right-hand side is an interesting one. That's a local charity here in the Northwest. And they did something that sort of kind of is unusual. They beat some very big national charities to win a contract that was actually technically a little bit too large for them. Because one of the things that public sector looks at is, are you financially stable enough to deliver the contract? And even though we probably know that we are, they have a rough rule of thumb that they will never tell you. And so this is just between you and I, but it's actually that they look for organisations that have a turnover that's at least 3 times the value, the annual value of the contract that they're actually tendering for. And in this case, I helped Vision to actually win a contract that was twice their annual turnover. But we spent some considerable time coming up with reasons why that would work, and we were able to actually weave those into our tender document. And as I say, they did fantastically well and won that. Manchester Care and Repair, that was a much larger organisation. Again, it's a charity. And again, won some, helped them to win a couple of big contracts there, including in consortium. So, you know, if they want to be working in consortium, that could be a great way to win contracts where 2 or more organisations get together and pool their skills and their resources to win it. And the one on the bottom, you can see my little logo there on the left-hand side, and that's a consortium that I put together of very small charities and social enterprises here in the Northwest that won a contract for 18 months. That worked really, really well, and just goes to show the power of actually putting organisations together, because they actually deliver positive activities for young people. And on the back of winning one contract, and this is a really, really good trick of the trade too, is they use their success in that to go on and win another much bigger framework contract, and they still work together today. So that was a lightning whistle-stop tour through public sector tendering, and I think, Julie, we've actually got time for questions.
Thank you, Melanie. That was fantastic. Lots and lots of information to take in, but like Melanie said, we've got the presentation that I can email out to everybody afterwards, and we've also recorded the webinar so you can listen again if you've missed anything. We've got a couple of questions. If anybody else has anything that they want to type in whilst we're on the line, we can see if Melanie can answer them. The first one is regarding policies for very early stage social entrepreneurs. Do you know of any websites that people can get templates from?
Yes, there are. I think my only caveat on there is just to be a little bit careful, because there's a lot of organisations out there that provide templates. A lot of them do charge for them. A couple of good places to go to start off with that are actually free is if you go to the Health and Safety Executive website, they have examples of health and safety policies. So that's a good place to get information on that. And similarly, you can go and look on, for example, the Department for Environment for information on environmental policies. What I've tended to find works really well is if you put a search in. So, for example, if you're looking for a safeguarding policy, a really great place to start is are the safeguarding policies of the organisation that you'd actually like to win some work with. So, for example, if you're looking at a local council, if you put into Google the local council's name and safeguarding children or safeguarding adults policy, it will usually pop it up for you, and then you can have a look at that. One of the better ways to do it, of course, is to talk to another social enterprise or charity that's been successful in winning tenders or more established than you are, and ask them if they're willing to share. I must admit that usually if people ask me, I'm usually willing to share with the usual caveat that they're written to my organisation and may not actually work for yours.
Right. Okay, thank you. How can you establish your competence if you are a new organisation?
Yeah, this is a tricky one. It's really frustrating when you see a public sector tender and you think, I can do that, but I've never actually offered any work. I mean, it's quite difficult for organisations that are brand new to win public sector tenders because you do have to build up that track record. But the way to build up the track record is by delivering work to other organisations and thinking about what work it is you delivered. So I won my first one in 6 months, just sort of 6 months in, but it was in something that I'm actually already really skilled in, and as an individual I have a strong track record. So I was able to talk not only about my organisation's track record, but my personal track record in that with evidence as well. So it does take a little bit of time, and in general, you're probably going to find it a little tricky to win public sector contracts until you've been trading for at least a year, by which time hopefully you'll have delivered work to other people that you can then use as part of your evidence.
Thank you. In terms of completing a PQQ or an ITT, how much time in the beginning do you think you should allocate to completing these?
An awful lot more than you think you need. It's interesting, even skilled companies actually underestimate it. In the beginning, if you're going to be writing a PQQ, you're going to want to probably set aside at least 5 days to do it properly. And that's assuming you've done some of that work that we've talked about there, like doing things like getting your documents ready. And that's because, you know, it's a little bit daunting the first time you do it. But as you get faster, you should be able to get pre-qualification questionnaires out in a day or two, because it becomes very repetitive and you get to know the questions that they ask and how you would normally respond. So in the beginning, at least a week for a PQQ. For the ITT, it depends on how complicated it is, and they do vary. Some can be quite simple and others can be very long. But I always allow, even now for myself, at least a week, and I tell people who are new to it to allow probably at least 2 weeks of their time to do it for the first time. And again, it's one of those things, you know, the more practice you get, the more you see, the more you look at them, the easier that they actually get. In terms of it, and that's your work content time, in terms of elapsed time, so that's the time, calendar time, I would always say start as soon as you get the document. because that's really important, because what tends to happen is people leave it to the last minute and they just run out of time.
Great, thank you. If you get the opportunity to go for an interview, how many people should you take to the interview with you?
That's always a really good question. The first thing that I normally do when I get asked to an interview is to ask who the other side is bringing. So who is the buyer bringing with them? And that gives me a kind of a feeling. So if they're just going to bring 2 people, then generally I would try hard not to take more than 4. If they were going to bring 5 or 6 people, then bringing 5 or 6 people yourself would be okay. What I look more at, though, is who do I really need there to actually be able to talk about the tender. The first one thing is that you need somebody who's very senior in your organisation, because like everything else, the buyer wants to know that this is really important to you to win, and that means usually having someone senior. So usually your chief exec, your managing director, or somebody that kind of level. But the slight danger of that is that they need to understand your tender. So you need somebody there who can really knows your tender inside out. One of the things that I do is if I can see that the buyer is bringing one of their financial people with them, and particularly if the pricing was a little complicated, I'll bring whoever did the pricing with me. And then the 4th person of the team that I will normally bring is somebody who's going to deliver the contract. And it's really interesting because, so a member of the delivery team, it's really interesting because the interview is one of those great opportunities where you can actually snatch it out of the hands of somebody who was actually, sort of at the top of the pack at that point in time. And one of the things that I've often done is won it on the personality. So your interview is your opportunity to show your passion and your personality. And it's that thing about, are these people that I really want to do business with? Can I see these people delivering to my service users? And so taking somebody who's really good on the delivery side and very personable can work really well. And that's actually how one of the examples on there, A Man for All Seasons, does so incredibly well. They tend to take their founder and also an apprentice who is actually learning disabled but who's absolutely passionate about what he does. So you can imagine that the combination of the one who knows everything and the one who's very passionate goes across really well.
Fantastic. Just back on to getting organised, you mentioned to me the other day the fact that insurance companies can actually email you over a copy of our insurance documents so you don't have to scan them in.
Yes, absolutely. These days, lots of the insurance companies actually can provide you with electronic certificates, so an electronic version, usually in a PDF file, and also an electronic version of all the terms and conditions and schedules that go with that. So certainly for my own case, I always ask for the electronic version. They can send you a paper version too. And the other thing, by the way, is often there's a slight discount if you do it online too. So yeah, that's something that you should be able to get, and just ask your insurance broker for that.
I like that. Just back onto the policies, what I just wanted to say from an unlimited point of view is that if people do have policies and draw them up but want them checked by a legal professional, if you contact me or come through the Unlimited Connect service, we work with some major law firms and some independent lawyers who are very happy to check individual policies.